This racist hotel tried to humiliate Mike Tyson, without knowing he was the owner. "Excuse me, sir, but I need you to step aside. This entrance is for our guests," the young receptionist said sharply, barely glancing up from her computer screen. Her tone carried the unmistakable edge of someone who had already made up their mind about the man standing before her. Mike Tyson, dressed casually in a gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, stood rooted to the spot. The lobby of the luxury hotel buzzed with activity, polished professionals wheeling sleek suitcases, a couple laughing as they checked in, and bellhops briskly maneuvering through the space. The chandelier overhead sparkled with opulence, but none of it could distract from the icy glare of the receptionist. "I'm here to check in," Mike said calmly, pulling his phone from his pocket. He extended it toward her, showing the confirmation email for his stay. The receptionist barely glanced at the screen before scoffing. "I'm not sure what kind of scam you're running, but this isn't the place for that. Perhaps you should try one of the budget motels on the other side of town." Her words landed like a slap. A hush fell over the nearby guests, their curiosity piqued by the brewing confrontation. Mike's broad shoulders tensed, but his expression remained calm. He had been through this before, too many times to count. People often judged him by his appearance before taking the time to see who he truly was. "I don't think you understand," Mike said, his voice steady but firm. "I have a reservation. It's under my name." The receptionist's lips curled into a mocking smile. "Oh, I understand perfectly. But this is a five-star establishment, and we don't cater to your type." Her eyes flicked over his clothes, then back to his face, lingering just long enough on his infamous facial tattoo to make her disdain unmistakable. A young couple standing nearby exchanged nervous glances, and an older man behind Mike whispered to his wife, "Is that who I think it is?" But the receptionist didn't seem to care, or notice, who she was talking to. To her, he was just another man who didn't fit the image of the elite clientele she was used to serving. Mike took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around his phone. "I don't want any trouble. I'm here for a peaceful stay, just like everyone else." The receptionist folded her arms across her chest, her voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know what kind of peaceful stay you're imagining, but you're not going to find it here. Please leave before I have to call security." The line behind Mike grew restless, with some guests shifting awkwardly and others openly gawking. His face burned with humiliation, but he refused to let it show. Decades of navigating public scrutiny had taught him to control his emotions, but the sting of being dismissed so casually, so cruelly, was hard to ignore. "Look," Mike tried one last time, his voice quieter now, tinged with the hurt he wouldn't allow to fully surface. "I'm not here to cause any problems. I just want to check into my room." The receptionist rolled her eyes and leaned over the counter, as though she needed to physically assert her authority. "I don't care who you think you are. Reservations like yours don't exist here." Her words echoed in his mind. "Who you think you are?" Mike could feel the stares of the people around him, the silent judgment they passed as they watched him endure this moment of indignity. Memories from his past came rushing back, memories of being rejected, mocked, and dismissed. In the corner of the lobby, a young boy tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, pointing at Mike, "isn't that the guy from the posters in your office?" The man hushed him quickly, his face turning pale as he realized who was standing just a few feet away. He didn't intervene, though. Nobody did. Mike glanced down at the phone still in his hand, the confirmation email glowing on the screen. He could have easily revealed his identity, but that wasn't the point. He wanted to be treated with the same respect as anyone else, not because of his fame, but because he was a human being. The receptionist's voice cut through his thoughts once more. "Security. Please escort this man out." A tall, burly guard emerged from the side of the lobby, his expression neutral as he approached. Mike looked up at him, locking eyes for a brief moment. The guard hesitated, seeming to recognize him, but the receptionist's sharp glare kept him moving forward. "Sir," the guard said, his voice low, "we need to ask you to leave." Mike's shoulders sagged slightly. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He'd spent his life fighting, but he knew this wasn't a battle he could win with force. He had always believed in picking his battles wisely, and this one wasn't worth escalating. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the grand lobby, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind him, he heard the receptionist mutter something to a colleague, her laughter sharp and dismissive. It took everything in him to keep walking. As he reached the revolving door, Mike paused for a moment and looked back. The receptionist was already back at her computer, typing away as though nothing had happened. She hadn't even bothered to ask his name. He stepped outside into the crisp air, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. For a moment, he stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the gleaming facade of the hotel. This was supposed to be a celebration, a quiet moment to enjoy the fruits of his hard work. Instead, it had become yet another reminder of the prejudice and judgment he had faced his entire life. Mike climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he took a deep breath. The pain was fresh, but beneath it, a fire began to burn, a determination to show them who he truly was. They thought they could dismiss him, but they didn't realize they had just dismissed the man who owned the very building they worked in. He wouldn't let this slide. Not because of his ego, but because he knew the damage moments like this could cause to others who didn't have the strength to fight back. "Let's see how this plays out," he murmured to himself, starting the engine and driving away, only for now. As Mike drove away from the hotel, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the tension from the encounter refusing to leave his body. The city streets blurred past him as his mind replayed every second of the humiliation he'd just endured. He could still hear the receptionist's sharp voice and the derisive laughter that followed him as he walked out. It wasn't just about her words, it was the reminder of a lifetime of being underestimated, dismissed, and judged. He thought about how far he had come from the streets of Brownsville, Brooklyn. Back then, people used to avoid him, crossing the street to keep their distance from the skinny kid with the torn clothes and angry eyes. Those same eyes now welled up with frustration as he realized that no matter how much he had achieved, no matter how much wealth or fame he had accumulated, to some people, he would always just be a stereotype. The irony wasn't lost on him. He owned the hotel. He had worked hard to build a life of dignity, to give people the very thing he'd never had growing up, a sense of belonging. Yet here he was, the man who had poured millions into creating a space where everyone was supposed to feel welcome, standing outside of it as though he didn't belong. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Jacob, the general manager he'd hired to oversee the hotel. "Welcome to the city, Mr. Tyson. Let me know if there's anything you need during your stay." Mike stared at the message for a long moment, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and resolve. He wasn't going to let this slide, not for his own sake, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small or invisible. He tapped out a response. "Jacob, meet me in the lobby in 2 hours. We need to talk." He didn't send anything more, didn't explain what had happened. Jacob was a good man, one of the few people Mike trusted to run things fairly. But even good men could be blind to what happened right under their noses. Mike intended to open his eyes. 2 hours later, Mike sat parked across the street from the hotel, watching guests come and go through the grand entrance. He wasn't dressed to impress, still in his hoodie and jeans, but that was intentional. He wanted to see if the receptionist's behavior was consistent or if he'd been singled out. As he watched, he saw her smile warmly at a middle-aged couple in tailored suits, handing them their room keys with a cheerful wave. Moments later, A young man with a backpack and a scruffy appearance approached the counter. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by the same cold, dismissive expression she'd shown Mike. She waved him off quickly, pointing toward the exit, and the young man left, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mike felt his jaw tighten. It wasn't just him. She had made up her mind about who belonged and who didn't, based solely on appearances. Mike stepped out of the car and crossed the street, his heart pounding. This time, he wasn't coming as a guest. He was coming as the owner. The moment he stepped into the lobby, the receptionist's eyes locked on him, and her lips curled into a familiar sneer. She clearly remembered him, and her disdain hadn't lessened. She opened her mouth, probably to dismiss him again, but before she could speak, Jacob appeared, striding toward Mike with a wide, welcoming smile. "Mr. Tyson," Jacob exclaimed, extending a hand. "It's so good to see you. I didn't expect you to arrive so soon." The receptionist's face froze in confusion, her eyes darting between Mike and Jacob. Mike shook Jacob's hand firmly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I had a bit of an earlier arrival than planned," Mike said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "I thought I'd take a look around and see how things are running." Jacob nodded eagerly, oblivious to the tension brewing beside him. "Of course, sir. Let me know if there's anything I can do to make your stay more comfortable." Mike glanced at the receptionist, whose face had gone pale. "Actually, there is something you can do," he said, his tone sharp enough to make Jacob pause. "I'd like to have a word with you and the front desk staff. Right now." Jacob hesitated, sensing the shift in Mike's demeanor. "Is something wrong, sir?" Mike's eyes didn't waver from the receptionist. "Let's just say I've had an interesting introduction to how your team handles guests." Jacob followed Mike's gaze, his brow furrowing as realization dawned. The receptionist's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the counter, her earlier confidence replaced with visible fear. The next moments passed in a blur. Jacob gathered the front desk staff in a private meeting room, their confused faces a stark contrast to Mike's steely expression. The receptionist sat stiffly in her chair, avoiding his gaze. She seemed to realize now who she had insulted, but it was too late to take anything back. Mike leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he spoke. "I came here as a guest. No fanfare, no special treatment, just a guest. And I was humiliated in front of a lobby full of people because someone made assumptions about me based on how I look." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. The receptionist's head hung low, her earlier bravado completely gone. Mike turned to Jacob, his voice still calm but laced with disappointment. "I trusted you to run this place in a way that made everyone feel welcome. Do you think that's what's happening here?" Jacob shook his head, his face pale. "No, sir. He glanced at the receptionist, struggling for words. "This is unacceptable." Mike nodded, his gaze never leaving the staff. "I've been judged my whole life. People have looked at me and decided they know who I am. I built this hotel because I wanted to create a space where that didn't happen. A space where people were treated like people, no matter where they come from or what they look like." The receptionist's voice was barely a whisper as she finally spoke. I didn't know who you were." Mike's laugh was short and humorless. "That's the point. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Her face crumpled, tears beginning to well in her eyes, but Mike didn't soften. This wasn't about making her feel bad, it was about accountability. If she learned anything from this, it had to be that actions had consequences. Mike left the meeting room, the weight of the confrontation lingering like a heavy fog in his chest. He had spoken his truth, made his point, but it didn't erase the sting of the receptionist's words or the humiliation he felt in the lobby. As he walked down the empty hallway, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors, memories from his past began to surface, unbidden and raw. He thought of his childhood, growing up in the toughest corners of Brooklyn, where every day felt like a fight for survival. Back then, people didn't see him as a person, they saw a troublemaker, a lost cause, a kid destined for prison. He remembered the way shop owners used to watch him closely, ready to accuse him of stealing even when his hands were empty. The way teachers dismissed him as a failure before he even opened his mouth. And the way strangers crossed the street when they saw him coming, as if his mere presence was a threat. The humiliation he experienced in that hotel lobby wasn't new. It was a replay of all those moments when the world had decided he wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't human. He thought about how hard he had worked to rise above it all, to prove them wrong. But no matter how many millions he earned, no matter how many titles he won, moments like this reminded him that, to some people, he would always be just another face they didn't want to see. His thoughts turned to the people who had betrayed him, who had taken advantage of his success and left him feeling even more isolated. Don King's grinning face flashed in his mind, a man who had promised to be his ally but had stolen millions from him without a second thought. And Robin, his ex-wife, who had once been the center of his world but had turned their love into a public spectacle, using his darkest moments to tear him down in front of everyone. It wasn't just the betrayals that hurt, it was the loneliness that followed. Each betrayal left him more guarded, more distrustful, and more convinced that no one truly saw him for who he was. Even in his moments of triumph, standing in the ring with his fists raised high, he often felt like a boy again, yearning for someone to look at him and see more than a fighter. The car ride back to his hotel suite was silent, the city lights casting fleeting patterns across his face. He stared out the window, his expression unreadable, his thoughts swirling. He had the power to fire the receptionist on the spot, to make an example of her. But would that really change anything? Would it undo the years of prejudice and judgment he had faced? Would it stop people like her from looking at others the way she had looked at him? When he finally stepped into his suite, the luxurious space felt cold and empty. The plush furniture, the crystal chandeliers, the breathtaking view of the city skyline, none of it mattered. For a moment, he stood in the middle of the room, the silence pressing down on him. Then, unable to sit still, he began to pace. The memory of her words haunted him, "We don't cater to people like you. People like you." It was such a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of centuries of judgment, rejection, and dehumanization. It wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, to feel less than, because of someone else's ignorance or arrogance. He thought about the young man with the backpack, the one he'd seen dismissed just as he had been. How many people like that young man had walked through the doors of his hotel, only to be turned away? How many had left feeling humiliated, their confidence shattered? He had built this hotel to be a sanctuary, a place where everyone could feel welcome. But if even one person walked away feeling unwelcome, then he had failed. Mike sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He wasn't the same angry, impulsive young man he had been in his 20s. Back then, he would have confronted the receptionist in the heat of the moment, his emotions spilling over like a dam breaking. But now, he had learned the value of patience, of choosing his battles carefully. Still, the frustration burned in his chest, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. He couldn't let this go, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt what he felt in that lobby. He needed to do something, to make a statement that would resonate beyond the walls of this hotel. He stood up, his mind racing. This wasn't just about punishing one person. It was about changing a culture, about holding people accountable for their actions and their attitudes. And it was about reminding himself, and others, that dignity couldn't be taken away by someone else's ignorance. Grabbing his phone, he dialed Jacob. The call rang twice before the manager answered, his voice cautious. "Mr. Tyson?" "Jacob," Mike said, his tone calm but firm. I need you to arrange a staff meeting tomorrow morning. I want every employee present." There was a pause. "Is everything okay, sir?" "It will be," Mike replied, his voice carrying a weight that made it clear this wasn't a request. "But we need to address something. And I want to be the one to do it." Jacob hesitated before answering. "Understood. I'll make the arrangements." Mike hung up, his gaze drifting toward the window. The city stretched out before him, vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the quiet storm brewing inside him. This wasn't just about righting a wrong, it was about sending a message, not just to the staff, but to himself. As the night deepened, Mike's resolve hardened. He wouldn't let this moment define him, just as he hadn't let the countless moments before it define him. He had fought too hard, endured too much, to let one person's ignorance overshadow his journey. Tomorrow, he would remind them, and himself, who he truly was. The next morning, the grand ballroom of the hotel was bustling with murmurs and hushed conversations. Every staff member had been summoned, housekeepers in crisp uniforms, bellhops adjusting their ties nervously, and chefs still wearing their kitchen aprons. The air was thick with tension, as no one knew exactly why they were there. The whispers grew louder as the staff noticed the receptionist sitting stiffly near the front, her face pale and her hands fidgeting in her lap. Mike Tyson entered the room quietly, his presence commanding immediate attention. Conversation ceased, and all eyes turned toward him. Many staff members recognized him instantly, their expressions shifting from confusion to awe. Others, less familiar with his legacy, sensed his authority regardless. He walked to the front of the room with an air of calm, his steps measured, his gaze steady. Jacob stood off to the side, his face a mix of concern and anticipation. Mike didn't waste time with pleasantries. He scanned the room, taking in the faces of his employees, people who worked tirelessly to maintain the hotel's reputation as a haven of luxury and service. But as he looked at them, he couldn't help but wonder how many shared the receptionist's narrow mindset, how many of them judged others based on their own biases. "I'm sure some of you are wondering why I called this meeting," Mike began, his voice steady and firm. "And I'll get straight to the point. Yesterday, I walked into this hotel, the hotel I own, just like any other guest. I didn't announce who I was. I didn't come in looking for special treatment. I came in as a man looking for a place to stay." He paused, letting his words settle in the room. The silence was deafening, the tension palpable. "But what I experienced," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "was nothing short of humiliation. I was judged. Not because of my reservation, not because of anything I said or did, but because of how I looked. Because of someone's assumptions about me." The receptionist's head dropped lower, her cheeks burning with shame. She didn't dare to meet his eyes. The rest of the staff sat frozen, the weight of his words sinking into their hearts. "I built this hotel," Mike said, his voice growing stronger, "to be more than just another luxury property. I wanted it to be a place where people felt valued, respected, and welcomed, no matter who they were or where they came from. That's the vision I had when I put my name behind this business. And if that vision isn't being honored, then we have a serious problem." His eyes scanned the room again, stopping briefly on the receptionist, whose hands were now trembling in her lap. He didn't single her out by name, but his message was clear. "I understand that everyone has biases. We all come with our own stories, our own struggles, and our own perspectives. But those biases don't belong here," Mike continued, his tone softening just slightly. "They don't belong in a place that's supposed to be a safe haven for people from all walks of life. When someone walks through those doors, they should feel like they matter. They should feel like they're respected." He took a step closer to the group, his gaze piercing. "What happened to me yesterday wasn't just about me. It was about every guest who has ever felt unwelcome, every person who has ever been judged because of the way they look, the way they dress, or where they come from. And that's not the kind of experience I'm going to allow in this hotel. The room remained silent, the staff hanging on his every word. Mike turned his attention to Jacob, who was standing off to the side, his expression serious. "Jacob," Mike said, "you've done a good job running this hotel. But it's clear there are gaps. We need better training, better accountability, and a stronger commitment to the values this place was built on. I'm holding you responsible for making sure this never happens again." Jacob nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I'll make it my top priority." Mike shifted his gaze back to the staff. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to set a standard. If you're part of this team, then you're part of something bigger. And that means treating every guest, every colleague, and every person who walks through those doors with the respect they deserve." He paused, his eyes locking on the receptionist for the first time since he began speaking. Her breathing hitched, and tears glistened in her eyes. "There's a lesson here for all of us," Mike said, his voice softer now but no less firm. "I'm not going to pretend this didn't hurt, because it did. But what hurts more is knowing that it could have happened to anyone else, and they might not have had the strength or the platform to speak up." He let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. "To those of you who treat every guest with kindness and respect, thank you. To those of you who don't, I hope this moment makes you think about why. Because this isn't just about your job. It's about the kind of person you are." Mike stepped back, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression resolute. "This hotel is a reflection of me. And I won't let it become a place where people feel small or invisible. That's not who I am, and that's not what this place is going to be." He turned to Jacob one last time. "Make the changes. And make sure everyone here understands what's expected of them. I'll be watching." Jacob nodded again, his face pale but determined. "I will, sir." Mike walked out of the ballroom without another word, leaving the staff in stunned silence. The weight of his speech lingered long after he was gone, and for many of them, it was a moment they would never forget. For the receptionist, it was a reckoning, a painful reminder of the consequences of her actions. She knew her days at the hotel were numbered, but more than that, she knew she had to face the shame of what she had done. Mike returned to his suite, his heart still heavy but his resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But for now, he had made his point, and he hoped it would echo far beyond the walls of the hotel. The next few days at the hotel were filled with a quiet but undeniable shift. Staff members moved with a sense of urgency and attentiveness, their usual routines laced with an undercurrent of unease. Word of Mike Tyson's speech had spread like wildfire, not only among the employees but also among the guests. Some had been in the lobby during the initial confrontation, and whispers of the incident had made their way into casual conversations over breakfast and evening drinks. Mike stayed in his suite, observing. He didn't demand special treatment or make his presence overly known, but he made it clear he was watching. The staff, especially those who had been at the meeting, worked diligently, aware that the man who had called them out was also the man who signed their paychecks. The receptionist, however, seemed like a ghost of her former self. Her usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost nervous demeanor. She avoided eye contact with guests and her colleagues, keeping her head down and her voice low. Each time Mike passed through the lobby, she stiffened, her hands trembling as she tried to maintain composure. She knew her time was running out, and the weight of her actions pressed down on her like an anchor. Mike, on the other hand, was far from finished. He spent his time talking to Jacob and other department heads, making it clear that changes were not only expected but non-negotiable. He reviewed policies, emphasizing the importance of diversity training and guest experience. He made a point to speak with employees across all levels, from housekeeping to kitchen staff, asking them about their experiences and ensuring that every voice was heard. One afternoon, as he walked through the hotel, he noticed the young man with the backpack he'd seen on his first day. The man was sitting in the lobby with a book in his hands, a look of hesitation on his face. Mike approached him quietly, his voice soft but firm. "Hey," he said, catching the man's attention. "You staying here?" The young man looked up, startled. No, sir. I tried to check in a few days ago, but," he trailed off, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Mike nodded, understanding immediately. "You were turned away." The man hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. I guess I didn't look like the kind of guest they wanted here." Mike pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to Jacob. "You do now," he said, gesturing toward the front desk. "Come with me." The man followed him hesitantly, unsure of what was happening. When they reached the counter, the receptionist looked up, her face paling when she saw Mike. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but he cut her off with a steady glare. "This gentleman needs a room," Mike said firmly. "Make it happen." Her hands fumbled with the keyboard as she processed the booking. The young man watched, wide-eyed, as Mike stood beside him, an unspoken shield against any further humiliation. Within moments, she handed over the room key, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," the young man said quietly, looking between her and Mike. He turned to Mike, his voice earnest. "And thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." "Don't worry about it," Mike replied. "Just enjoy your stay." As the man headed toward the elevators, Mike turned back to the receptionist. Her face was pale, her eyes avoiding his. "This is your last chance," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to like everyone who walks through those doors. But you do have to treat them with respect. If you can't do that, you're in the wrong job." She nodded quickly, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." Mike didn't linger. He had made his point, and he knew she wouldn't forget it. That evening, Jacob invited Mike to join a small gathering of the management team in one of the private dining rooms. They wanted to thank him for addressing the issues so directly and for giving them the opportunity to improve. As they ate, Jacob shared some of the feedback he'd received from the staff since the meeting. Some of them were nervous at first, Jacob admitted, but a lot of them said they're glad you called us out. They feel like this place is going to be better now, fairer, more welcoming. Mike listened quietly, nodding. He appreciated the sentiment, but he knew there was still work to be done. Change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without effort. But the fact that the staff was willing to reflect and improve gave him hope. After the dinner, Mike returned to his suite, exhausted but satisfied. As he stood by the window, looking out over the city, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. This wasn't the first time he'd had to fight for respect, and it wouldn't be the last. But this fight felt different. It wasn't just about him, it was about creating something bigger, something that could outlast him. He thought about the young man with the backpack, about the staff who were finally starting to see the bigger picture, and even about the receptionist, who seemed to be grappling with the consequences of her actions. Each of them represented a piece of the larger puzzle, a step toward the kind of world he wanted to help build. As the city lights twinkled in the distance, Mike felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had faced humiliation, rejection, and judgment, but he had turned those moments into opportunities for growth and change. And in doing so, he had reminded himself of the resilience that had carried him through every battle, both in the ring and out of it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, Mike allowed himself to breathe, knowing that he had taken another step towards something greater. The next morning, the hotel was alive with its usual energy, guests checking in and out, the clinking of glasses in the restaurant, and the distant hum of housekeeping carts moving through the hallways. Mike walked through the lobby, his presence calm but commanding. He nodded at the staff as he passed, each of them straightening up slightly under his gaze. The receptionist, still at her post, offered a weak, tentative smile, unsure if she was truly out of the woods. Mike wasn't angry anymore, but he wasn't done. There was one final move to make, one that would ensure the lessons of the past few days left a lasting impression. He entered the hotel's executive boardroom, where Jacob and the senior management team were waiting, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. They had been called to a special meeting, but no one knew why. "Thank you all for coming," Mike began, taking his place at the head of the table. His tone was measured, but there was a spark of something beneath it, an energy that hinted at more to come. "I've spent the past few days observing, talking to staff, and thinking about what this hotel represents. I've seen some great things, but I've also seen things that need to change. Today, we're going to talk about that." The team nodded, exchanging nervous glances. Jacob spoke first, his voice careful. "Mr. Tyson, I want to assure you that we're fully committed to making the changes you outlined. We've already scheduled diversity training, and I've spoken to the front desk staff about their conduct. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Mike smiled faintly, appreciating the effort but knowing there was more to be said. "That's a good start, Jacob. But I want to make sure we're thinking beyond just policies and training. I want this hotel to be a beacon of what hospitality can and should be." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "That's why I've decided to make some changes, starting with ownership." The room fell silent, the air suddenly thick with confusion. Jacob leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Ownership, sir?" Mike nodded, his expression unreadable. "I bought this hotel because I believed in its potential. But after what I experienced here, I realized that it's not enough for me to own it. I need to ensure it's run by someone who understands what it means to fight for respect, to work hard for everything they have, and to treat people with dignity." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady as he delivered the bombshell. "Effective immediately, I'm transferring ownership of this hotel to someone who embodies those values." The staff stared at him, stunned. Jacob's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Before anyone could respond, the door to the boardroom opened, and in walked the young man with the backpack, the one Mike had helped check in just days earlier. The room collectively turned to him, their expressions ranging from disbelief to confusion. The young man hesitated for a moment, then straightened his posture, his face a mix of nervousness and determination. "Everyone," Mike said, gesturing toward him, "meet Marcus. He's a hospitality management graduate who's been working odd jobs just to stay afloat. He's also the new co-owner of this hotel." The silence was deafening. Marcus's eyes widened, his shock mirroring that of everyone in the room. "Mr. Tyson," he stammered, I don't know what to say. I can't." "Yes, you can," Mike interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "I've read about you. I know what you've been through. You remind me of myself, hungry, determined, and ready to prove everyone wrong. You've got the skills and the heart for this, Marcus. All you need is the opportunity." The staff looked at each other, processing what was happening. Jacob finally found his voice. "Sir, are you sure about this? Ownership isn't something you can just—" "I'm very sure," Mike said, cutting him off. "I'm not stepping away completely. I'll still be involved. But Marcus is going to bring a perspective this place needs, one that comes from someone who understands the importance of respect because he's had to earn it every day." Marcus stood frozen, his hands trembling. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Mike smiled. "Because someone gave me a chance when no one else believed in me. And I'm here today because of that. Now it's your turn." The staff began to clap, slowly at first, then building into a round of applause that filled the room. Marcus's eyes glistened with tears as he stepped forward, shaking Mike's hand with both of his. "I won't let you down," Marcus said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I know you won't," Mike replied. "But remember, this isn't just about proving yourself. It's about making this place better for everyone who walks through those doors." As the meeting ended, Marcus stayed behind, still processing the whirlwind of events. Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this," Mike said. "And if anyone doubts you, remind them who believed in you first." Marcus nodded, his confidence growing. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. As Mike walked out of the boardroom, he glanced back, seeing Marcus standing tall among the staff, his presence already commanding respect. Mike smiled to himself. This was the legacy he wanted to leave, not just a hotel, but a symbol of what it meant to rise above and lift others with you. And as for the receptionist, she was left to ponder not only the consequences of her actions but the opportunities she had squandered. Mike had given her a chance to change, but the real question was whether she would take it. For Mike, the fight was over. And in the end, he had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small.